Well, good evening, and what a great way to start with the opening track of the amazing X-Ray Specs' album Germ-Free Adolescence out official. Just a track that is so fantastic and such a good way to start tonight. Welcome to very special thinking, which we've entitled Never Mind the Bigots, Could Punk Save the 21st Century? Good question. I'm Matt D'Ancona and I'm an editor at Tortoise Media, and I'm really delighted you're able to join us at this event. I think it's going to be fascinating to discuss what's a truly interesting cultural question. As ever, we want to hear what you think, so please do fire your thoughts and ideas into the chat, which will be overseen this evening by my colleague and fellow editor and partner, Liz Mosley. We've got two remarkable speakers tonight who I'm going to chat to in a moment. They are Celeste Bell, a writer and filmmaker whose recent film about her mother, the lead singer and driving force behind the great X-Ray Specs Polystyrene, I'm a Cliche, is one of the absolute must-see movies of the year so far. She's also the author of this terrific book, which I have to hand, Dayglow, on her mother's life and influence. I thoroughly recommend it, and has also fronted her own band, Debutante Disco, which is, I think, variously known as Debutante Disco and the Tabloid Queens. Is that right, Celeste? But we'll talk about that in a minute. Another book I'm very much looking forward to and have already ordered is by our second speaker, Stephanie Phillips. It's called Why Solange Matters, published by Faber, about the life and career of Solange Knowles. And it's out next month from Faber, as I said. Really one to look out for. She has so many things she does. She's one of the founder members of a terrific punk band called Big Joanie. We'll put links in the chat to that. And she's also a creative force behind the Decolonise Fest, which is a London-based festival created by and for punks of colour. So two terrific speakers, and we welcome them both. Now, since we're talking about a musical movement that has its roots in the 70s, we are bound to reference the past a fair amount tonight, and that is terrific. But I don't want this to be a retro event, but something perhaps a little bit different, which is to ask if the spirit of punk, its recoil from authority and uniformity, its DIY ethos, its combination of individualism and solidarity, its cultural assault on norms and old ideas might just have greater relevance today, or a renewed relevance. And so that's what we'll be trying to drill into, as well as, of course, reliving some of the past memories of punk glory. So without any more preamble from me, let's dive in. Celeste, welcome. Tell us a bit about how you came to make the film, and perhaps what it taught you about your mother that you didn't know before.
So I came to make the film via the book, really. So at the end of 2016, I joined forces with Zoe Howe. She'd interviewed me a few years previous about for a book that she was writing called How's Your Dad? Living in the Shadow of a Rock Star Parent. And the book was about, kids of musicians who are well known. And she interviewed me backstage at a gig that I did at Cargo. And I really got on with Zoe, and we kept in touch. And in about 2015, I started to really go through my mother's artistic archive that she left when she passed away. And I decided, when I was going through it, that there was such a wealth of material there, that it would be a good idea to publish some of the artwork alongside some of my mum's diary entries. So she'd written these diary entries in the early 2000s, and it was a kind of retrospective look at what she was doing at the time of the album Germ-Free Adolescence. So she had small, short diary entries for each track on the album. And I wanted to put together these diary entries with the artwork as a kind of coffee table book. So I approached Zoe and asked her if she would like to do it with me. And she was really up for it. And then it just kind of grew into something more biographical. Shortly after Zoe and I started on the project, Zoe introduced me to Paul Sung, who was really keen to kind of document the process into a documentary film format. And we just sort of hit it off as a team, the three of us, and we embarked on the film project at the beginning of 2017 with our first crowdfunding campaign, which was pretty successful.
So one of the things that really leapt out at me seeing the film and being old enough to have enjoyed the records first time round was how contemporary they still are. You know, it's you know, the themes about commodity culture, the environment. I mean, your mother was a true pioneer in that, and it's amazing how it's not just that the records have aged well, but they seem almost more relevant now than ever before. I mean, did that kind of, had you always known that about her, or did it strike you afresh when you were doing the film?
I mean, I always understood that to a certain degree, because the lyrics, you know, they were fresh when my mum wrote them, and then they were fresh when I started listening to the album when I was a teenager, and they're fresh now. But I do think, you know, I would say that during the last 20 years or so, I feel like the lyrics have had more relevance than ever, largely due to, I guess, there being more focus and more attention on some of the issues she was sort of highlighting in those songs. So issues such as environmental concerns, you know, with the movement, you know, new kind of environmentalist movement led by people like Greta Thunberg and you know, Extinction Rebellion, and there's been this renewed interest in environmental activism, and of course identity politics. Identity has become a very important subject as well in society that people are concerned about and talking about. And so I think, you know, and it's not just there, it's even in terms of technological progress. You know, my mum wrote a song called Genetic Engineering, and it wasn't until relatively recently that genetic engineering has actually become a reality, you know, with Dolly, the sheep, the first genetically engineered sheep. So that was, you know, quite a while after my mum wrote that song. So, you know, it's pretty much every song you can say, oh, actually, this is so relevant to our time now.
It's very interesting because obviously one can't know, but you're better placed than anyone. You know, the vitality of punk was so much of the moment, but she clearly was thinking on a longer term. I mean, do you think she was conscious in her lifetime of the fact that these were issues that were going to be with us for the foreseeable future? Did she have that kind of vision, or did her art work in a different way?
My mother had a great ability to take in what was happening and then kind of run away with it. And she was constantly inspired by news. She was an avid sort of news junkie, always reading the newspaper, always watching the news on telly, always listening to the news on the radio. I think she got a lot of her inspiration from the news, right, you know, when she was super young, all the way throughout her life in terms of writing inspiration. And I think what my mum was able to do was to take, you know, to see an article, for example, genetic engineering was inspired by an article in Time magazine back in the 70s. And what she did is she would see an article, she would, you know, it would pique her interest, and then she would just let her imagination run riot. But the crazy thing is that she, you know, her imagination was actually foresight and a kind of uncanny prediction. You know, she had this ability to predict trends.
Yeah, because very few people, literally, you know, very few people were thinking like that. And certainly in musical culture, vanishingly few people were thinking like that at the time of punk, that I'm aware of anyway. That connection hadn't been drawn.
No. And I guess, you know, my mother belonged to a kind of, there has been this movement in art and culture and music for a long time, which is, I guess, futurism is how you can describe it. And my mother was very much a futurist. And, you know, she was exploring these themes, not just in her music, but also in her artwork, visual art. And she was always one step ahead in terms of culture and what was going to happen next. I guess she would have had a great career as a trend forecaster.
Well, I think she forecasts a fair few. She's very lucky to have you to you know, curate these amazing memories for us. Celeste, we'll thank you. We'll come back to you very shortly. Can I turn to you, Steph? Welcome. Thank you so much for doing this. Can you tell us a little bit about your personal embrace of punk? And you know, you're a writer, you're a performer, you're an activist. What does the punk ethos mean to you, and how did you come to embrace it?
Sure, I guess, like, I mean, my, you know, embracement of punk is kind of the same as a lot of people's. I grew up in Wolverhampton, and I was, you know, I felt like a bit of a loner in many ways. I was kind of one of the few Black girls in my school and one of the few people into the music that I was into. I didn't really have many people to share it with. And I kind of stumbled across punk kind of because I was a bit of a music nerd anyway. I'd listened to lots of kind of British indie bands like Block Party, and then I progressed to, you know, the White Stripes, and then to Le Tigre, and which is Kathleen Hanna's band. And then it was just kind of the process of just doing lots and lots of research online. And I found the Kill Rock Stars site, which was the record label that what Big Joanie are on right now, and in the US that released a lot of riot girl and punk music in the 90s. And that's when I really connected with the ethos of punk, in that the idea is that, you know, our culture is there for us to create and not just consume. So it's the literal ethos that you are a part of, as much a part of the culture as anyone else is. And for someone that felt like they didn't really have any, you know, I didn't feel like I had anything of my own. I felt like I didn't have a voice. That was something that I really needed and really clinged on to have a voice. And I just continue to kind of seek out those spaces, and seek out spaces where people were like me, because even though I felt like a bit of a weirdo, I knew that I couldn't be the only person that was interested in these kind of concepts and interested in kind of rebelling against kind of the norms of the given way of that things are. It didn't really make any sense that this is just the way it's supposed to be, and, you know, there was never any questioning of it.
Were there any particular groups from the 70s that you listened to a lot when you were kind of going through that process?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the first one is really obvious, but it was X-Ray Specs. It was like finding Oh Bondage Up Yours and being, I think I was 14 and I didn't understand what the lyrics meant. I thought it was literal. So I would like only play it on my headphones and play it really quietly so my mom didn't hear. I thought she'd like, oh, I'd get in trouble, listen to songs about bondage. But I loved it. And again, like as a Black girl into punk, I even though I was looking at a black and white picture, I knew that's a Black woman that's looking at me. And that was an instant connection. And that was kind of a realization that, oh, this is something that, you know, I'm not the only one. There's people that have come before me. If this person is here at this moment, you know, in a scene that was supposedly white. It wasn't, there was this woman here and doing amazing things. And obviously now we know there were so many people doing amazing things back then. But yeah, it was, X-Ray Specs, kind of listening to that album, Germ Free Adolescence. Also the Slits were really influential, and just really, I wish I could play guitar like Big Albertine. It's such a creative way to think about the world. The Slits, the Raincoats as well, were huge influences. And then I later then found the men. I don't know how I skipped all the men in music history, but I just always managed to skip men for some reason. But then I later came to, the Clash and the Buzzcocks and everyone else.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because the bands that have in the documentary, Celeste obviously, markedly excluded from that, but most documentaries do focus on white men in bands. But actually, if you look at in more detail at the reality of what was going on, I mean, there's a case to be made that some people think Bad Brains were the greatest punk group ever, and it's not a bad call. There's a case for that, and the interesting thing about punk, I think, was that it was an inclusive moment. Not suggesting that it lasted. The 80s were very different, but women, there were women like Polly who are just doing incredible things. The Slits. It seemed to me as a movement, it had intimate links to Rasta. There were all sorts of tendrils coming out of punk that were not straightforwardly white and male, and it was almost an opportunity that didn't quite fulfill its promise, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think that's again down to the way that we remember history. Kind of recall things. Our recollection is always very different to the way it actually take place. And like you're saying, the 70s punk movement, that was massively inspired by reggae music, and reggae music then and now, even though it's not always remembered as such, is kind of inherently rebellious. It's about it is the music of the people, and my family is all Jamaican, and it's music about kind of working class people standing up for themselves and fighting against oppressive forces. So that is inherently punk, and that's kind of this other culture that's coming in and clashing in, and especially at the 70s when there was just that kind of rise in multiculturalism in the cities. It's obvious that there was more influences than just, I don't know who they thought influenced, the Clash, and the Slits was basically kind of, dub and reggae and all of that. So it's interesting that it gets misremembered, I think, because it becomes more important. It's over the years, it was so long ago now that people see it as kind of a just a kind of nostalgia kind of act, and then kind of forget that it had more teeth than it actually did. And it's a weird kind of thing that happens. And just as as a Black person in punk, it feels like it's inherently punk to whatever I do in that sense. So that's why it feels like this is the natural place for.
Well, that's what's so interesting about what you do, Steph, is that it's kind of that it's a place and a spirit rather than a kind of retro tribute to a decade that's a very long time ago. And with the band, and I'm very interested in, you tell us about the festival you run, because that seems to me to be, or you're involved with it, it seems to me to be a really interesting example of how punk is not, it's very far from what might be its stereotypical image of a white man in tartan trousers with a mohawk on a postcard.
I think it's because it was kind of left to its own devices. People think punk was just like a 5-minute scene and then it disappeared by 79. It didn't really. It kept going. It kept thriving. It moved to the suburbs. It crossed seas, and it's been an inherent part of a lot of youth culture. And so we come to the place where we are now, and actually it's kind of crossed so many boundaries. It's become a really important part of a lot of people of colour's upbringing and a lot of the way that they see themselves. You know, I see myself as a punk and as a Black woman, and both those identities are very important to me. So it came to that point where it felt like, you know, we were kind of making these moves and kind of doing so many things within the punk scene. There have been kind of countless examples, from Bad Brains to Death to Polly to you know, you name it, over the years in the 90s, and you know, Skin, and you know, people that are around today, like Rachel Aggs is in how many different punk bands and is playing amazing guitar. There are so many different examples of people of colour not only kind of existing in the punk scene, but moving the punk scene forward. They were the inherent part of the scene and kind of influencing other people, that when it came to who was represented, when it came to who got the documentaries, who was on the main stages, who was talked about, it was never people of colour. And it felt like there needed to be a space to have that for ourselves and to celebrate ourselves. And to be able to kind of say that we don't need to separate our two identities. We don't need to be, you know, Black over here and punk over here. They're both the same and they both interconnect. So that was kind of the ethos of Decolonise Fest in the starting. And the way that we run things is kind of inherently kind of punk and DIY as well. So we're a collective, and that's very important to the way that we run things. We don't have a hierarchy, and you know, we don't really kind of think of anything that, you know, it was one person that started anything or that it's kind of, we're all working towards the same goal of trying to, you know, diversify the punk scene, trying to celebrate the people that came before us, but also to try and create more space for people to, you know, so there are more bands, so there are more ways that people can kind of be and can create music. And therefore, if you're, you know, if you're able to be yourself, full self, and create the music that you want, you'll then take that kind of ethos into the rest of your life. And, you know, say, if I want to, if I have enough confidence to go on stage and say these things, I have enough confidence to say that to my boss, or say that to my landlord, or say that to, you know, the person that's kind of running riot, you know, in the government. And, you know, it's about kind of creating those small changes that lead to the bigger changes that can hopefully change the world. Fingers crossed.
And when you're looking at the kind of dynamic social justice movements that have been going on in the last couple of years, and you know, especially since the murder of George Floyd, with the, you know, upsurge of BLM, we've seen the response to the killing of Sarah Everard. There's an urgency and a kind of insistence in this, which does have, to my eyes anyway, echoes of punk in it. Do you see those echoes too?
Yeah, I definitely do. I think that there's, I can tell that a lot of people have been inspired by past movements. And a lot of the kind of protesting is about kind of people just wanting to take things into their own hands, because they can't rely on they can't rely on the establishment. And that is something that's kind of, you know, inherently punk, about, you know, recognizing that you have the power and you have that control within yourself, and it's not about the few, it's about the many. And I think there's, hopefully, if as we continue, hopefully there'll be more things that we take from the 70s. There were so many amazing movements when it comes to, you know, the I can't remember the exact phrase, but it was like the youth against skinheads, youth against Nazis movement. That was like an amazing rock against racism as well. But there was
great Victoria Park gig.
Yes, yeah. So I mean, that would be amazing, you know, to have something like that where it's kind of, you know, in your face, and establish that we're, you know, not only we're against it, we're going to fight it properly. Yeah. You know, and I think there was like a youth against Nazis and skinhead movement that was kind of young people in schools having like a little kind of badge on them to say that they're, you know, they're against racism, which is amazing, and which is kind of what we saw in the Pimlico school. That was kids kind of getting together, talking, sharing things within themselves, and recognizing that they could make that change, that they're as much as a part of the school as the teachers are and as the head teacher is.
I mean, I wonder whether part of it is that in the same way as the DIY element of punk sort of punk 1.0 in the late 70s was, you know, learn 3 chords and play them on a guitar, that technology has given, as it, you know, any kid anywhere the means of production. You know, you can set up a movement, you can set up a rally, you can record music, you can do things that previously you'd have needed hundreds of thousands of pounds to do. And I just wonder whether that the flattening of you know, for all its ills, all the ills of big tech, the flattening ability of the democratizing ability you get from tech has played a part in all of this. I
mean, it's certainly helped in ways to mobilize. That's the best way you can do it. You can reach, you know, millions of people through social media, through Twitter. I think that, you know, there are so many campaigns that have been run through WhatsApp and just kind of messaging networks. I feel like there does need to be the balance, though, of, you know, doing things on social media, but then also kind of meeting in real life to kind of see where those changes need to happen, because there's only so much you can do online that, you know, you need to kind of be able to kind of process that later on. But it has, yeah, you're right, it has kind of seized the means of production in that kind of, it is a very freeing thing to be able to see that real change and kind of see those kind of people and see those numbers gathering.
Thank you so much, Steph. I'm sure we'll come back to you shortly. I wondered if I might go to Liesl MacDonald, who had a very... Are you there? Sorry, Liesl. I caught you on the hop.
Okay.
Caught you on the hop. Lovely to see you. How are you?
Good, thank you.
You made a very good, interesting point in the chat, which I don't want to paraphrase, but about how essentially punk is not a fashion. And I wondered if you could kind of elaborate on that, because it seemed to me to be kind of at the heart of everything we're discussing this evening.
Yeah, it's kind of, so many things now have been co-opted into a visual rather than actually something more fundamental, which was, it was a way of looking at things. It was about thinking about things and fighting against things. But also I would want to say that as I was young when punk was out, punks were kind. They were kind to small kids and grannies. They looked scary and they fought, but they fought for the right things and in the right places generally. So it really was a kind of an anti-establishment movement rather than a fashion look or anything more sort of sinister. There was a lot of, you know, in its purest form, it was fighting against the right things, but also being, you know, decent human beings who looked scary, but were actually, you know, genuinely nice, ordinary people trying to do things to make the world better.
Yeah, it was that wonderful. There's the wonderful John Lydon quote about being beautiful and not being beautiful, which I like very much. I mean, I suppose the question is, having seen it first time round, do you see some of the movements that are going on now and the energy there is around youth culture and the undoubted generational shift towards what Celeste mentioned earlier, the identity politics? Does it carry echoes of what you experienced in those days?
I think it does. The one thing I personally struggle with is trying to get my head around the fact that although we're a lot more connected, there seems to be a lot more fragmentation and sort of causes and groups, in the sense of political groups, and also musical, the way music is now consumed and sold is so fragmented and turns over so quickly. It doesn't feel that there are many things that get to take a hold and really mature and develop, and artists get the chance to be, you know, have their point of view fully developed, their music fully developed, and their activism fully developed, because the pace of change is so quick now. So there is something like the Black Lives Matter movement, which isn't isn't necessarily about the music, but you know, people can coalesce around that. I think when it comes to the punk music, I would struggle. Sort of punk as a concept, I would struggle to put my finger on something where I could say it sort of had those characteristics.
Yes, it's very interesting. I mean, it depends, I suppose, on whether you limit the punk ethos to music and you know, formal kinds of art, or whether you can see it developing in social movements as well. And I think you're right that it is visible in some of those social justice movements, and maybe that's where part to a large extent it's moved in the way, because the musical ecosphere is so different to what it was in the late 70s. Thanks so much, Isel. Can I go to Nick Ratcliffe now? Nick, hi. How are you? Good to see you. Nick, you mentioned Susie Sue, and I just thought, you know, no account of punk really can ignore her majesty and greatness, and what she meant to you, and what perhaps as interesting, what she means to you today.
Thank you. Gosh, I was like Liesl. I was kind of growing up as a teenager in the mid-70s, and I was lucky enough to see the Banshees and a bunch of other similar acts sort of in 78, 79. And it was an exciting time to be alive, and there was this, obviously music was sort of changing very rapidly, and Susie, I guess, it was unusual in those days, like Polystyrene, in being you know, a female sort of lead singer, and it was very much Susie and the Banshees, as opposed to, you know, her being part of, you know, she was part of the band, but she was very much the icon. And I think she was just very different and stood out as a strong female in those days, and still does. I mean, I saw one of her very last concerts, well, what I presume is one of her last concerts, so she hasn't played any since, at the Royal Festival Hall, maybe sort of 8-10 years ago. And I took my son then, and he was sort of a bit blown away. I think she just stands as somebody who was, as I said in the chat, sort of almost stepped out of the audience onto the stage and then owned it. And you know, knew when to stop as well, and more or less quit when she was ahead. But she was just an innovator, and also visually, I think, you know, in terms of what you know, how she looked and what she wore, very, very iconic, and ultimately, to some extent, you know, gave rise to the whole goth movement that followed, and that never really matched her. Some of her politics were a bit sort of sometimes a bit questionable, but I think, you know, as somebody who really didn't, it wasn't like anything had gone before. She was really quite an original act.
Thank you very much. I couldn't agree. I agree with every single word. Is Zebedee there? Zebedee Albee.
Yeah. Hi. Hello.
Hi, Zebedee. How are you?
I'm okay. Just put the light on. Sorry.
I was going to say you're
Yeah. Hi.
you look like you're in a police protection program there, sort of in the dark. Oh, there we are. There we are. Good to see you. Now, you put a really interesting comment in the chat, and it's interesting to me because I wrote that slow review about Iggy Pop and Raw Power being the birth of punk, but I'm very open to suggestions that it wasn't. And you mentioned Dylan, so please explain that, because that's a really interesting theory.
Well, I think, you know, if you did try to pinpoint it, you know, probably Iggy Pop is the guy, you know, who started. Although the Velvet Underground may have a claim as well, but Bob Dylan, when he you know, thrashed on the piano in imitation of Little Richard at Hibbing High School when he was probably about, I don't know, 16, 17. I mean, he probably didn't sound that musical actually, but so that might have been punk. But really, it has to be, you know, either Lou Reed or Iggy Pop or somebody like that. But
it's interesting because the reason I really like your theory, even though it drives a coach and horses through mine, is that I think you're right, because I think that there's a tendency. I mean, there's a sort of Malcolm McLaren never trust a hippie kind of shtick, but actually you know, all these movements have things in common, and one of the things that they have in common is, you know, being true to yourself and not necessarily trusting authority and taking action yourself. And I just wonder whether you know, you might, you know, some people would go further back to the Beats even and say that's when punk started. So it's a very interesting, you know, the family tree may go back a long way.
Oh, the Beat poets, you mean?
Yeah, like, you know,
Yeah,
Ginsberg
yeah,
and
yeah.
Kerouac and so on.
Yeah, I mean, to me, you know, it's now looking back on it all, you know, it's all just music. You know, I love all of it. You know, I love I love Little Richard. I love John Lydon. All of it makes you know, makes sense to me, and is good, enjoyable stuff. So I don't particularly see it as you know, sort of divisive or different things. It's all just you know, as Ellington said, you know, good or bad music, really. But there it is. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, thanks so much for that. I wonder if I might come back to Celeste, actually, which is to slightly, you know, again, to look at the whole issue in contemporary terms, which is the feminist dimension to punk and what's followed. You know, the Slits, Your Mum, Pussy Riot. There's always been this very strong feminist element to punk. And I just wonder whether you think that survives to this day, and you know, is it a flickering flame that might snuff out at any moment, or is it actually quite a powerful force?
I mean, so first of all, my mum, you know, she never really described herself as a feminist.
Yeah.
However, she was kind of a living embodiment of feminism at the same time. But she wasn't very keen on labels, especially at that time in her life. And we explore that in the film, actually, her relationship with feminism and what it meant to her. But I think in terms of, you know, what my mother did within that movement, so not just within punk, but also within rock music, and within popular music, was to create she was a kind of represented a new model of a female performer. And it was not what she was doing that was really radical, was trying to remove sexiness or her physical appearance being the focus of her as a female performer. I would say there are very few women, female artists, who, even at the time, even contemporaries of hers, even within punk, who were not in some way playing on sex, or sexiness or attractiveness, to sell records. That was something my mum was very critical of. You could say even she was a bit prudish, you know, she took it really quite far, that position. And she famously said that she would shave her head if she ever became a sex symbol. And she did shave her head. So I would say that in terms of where we are now, I think it's you know, the fact is that there are very few female artists, female performers within the music industry that are not in some ways either pressured or, you know, have the tendency to fall into the trap of using sex or sexiness to sell music. I think it's worse now, really, than it ever has been, in terms of the pressure that women are under in terms of their appearance, especially in that scene, in the music scene. But obviously, actresses and any woman in the public eye is facing a similar kind of pressure. So I think what my mum was trying to do was quite unique. There weren't many women doing it at the time, and there still are not many women doing it today. Although there are, you know, there are women doing it, but I would say not many women who are very high profile.
I mean, it's really very hard to communicate at this distance how incredible it was when she marched on stage, you know, wearing a little hat with her braces and a soldier's tunic. That was not what a female pop star singer did.
Mhm.
And you know, I think that still resonates somehow in many ways, you know, though not, as you say, not necessarily replicated.
Yeah, I think, you know, my mother, she adored fashion. She loved dressing up. She was very creative with what she wore. You know, it was a big part of her identity as an artist was clothes. But she was, you know, enjoying fashion without, you know, she wasn't, she made a conscious effort not to reveal too much and not to be, she felt that it was a distraction from her artistry and from the music and from the serious things that she was talking about in those lyrics. And she wanted to be taken seriously, and she felt that it was really hard for a woman in the music industry to be taken seriously. And one of the reasons she felt was that you know, there was a kind of showgirl element always, you know, so there was the kind of, many female performers had to be kind of showgirls as well as be musicians, you know. And you see it even today in the fact that there are so many female performers, they will go on stage in basically their underwear, you know, without any pants on, and it's got nothing to do with the music. No, so, you know, what is that? What is the motivation behind that? You know, my mother felt that in itself was a huge distraction, and it was something that she always wanted to avoid. And she recommended also for me to always avoid that kind of trap that, you know, so many women kind of fall into.
But certainly, you know, the male bands were not subject to the same kind of pressures as, say, the Runaways or the Go-Go's. That's for sure in that respect. Thanks, Celeste. I'd love to come back to Steph just to talk a little bit more about the book, which, as I said, I'm hugely looking forward to. And perhaps you can tell us a little bit about Solange and how she fits into, you know, your work and your, you know, your whole exploration of these themes.
Yeah, sure. So the book is kind of looking at Solange Knowles's entire life and career, and coming up from the standpoint that, you know, Solange Knowles started out as a little sister to the world's biggest pop star, and kind of exploring what that means to be in someone's shadow, and someone's shadow who is that, you know, amazing, and how she had to kind of really go inwards and try out these really different routes to explore who she was, to then come back around and create her most critically acclaimed album, A Seat at the Table, which became a really, you know, useful lifeboat for a lot of people, especially for a lot of Black people. When it was released in 2016, just before Donald Trump got elected, and kind of when there were kind of waves of protests and a lot of police violence, and the themes on the album really spoke to a generation. And I think she's a really interesting artist in that she's not technically a punk artist, but she has described that album as her punk album. So I think that's something that I kind of explored, of looking at what does that mean, that punk in that sense, and kind of looking at how she kind of took elements of what she saw as a rebellious movement of punk and used that in her own way in a kind of deconstructed R&B album thing.
And did she collaborate with the book? Was she helpful, or?
No, I didn't actually get the chance to speak to her. I emailed her people a lot.
Yeah.
But I think that was good in the end, actually, because being able to look at it from an outside vantage point was really useful, to kind of build up this image of who this person is, and what she was aiming for. I think I got a better understanding of her in a weird way, kind of just from looking at it from around her and from the people that were around her as well.
No, I can't wait. It's just such a fascinating fascinating subject. I hope we've got a link in the chat so people can order it on the Tortoise bookstore. Can I come now to my colleague Mark Stander, who's had a huge hand putting this evening together. So thanks, Mark. But you were saying in the chat, Mark, that you know, punk is not. It's an ethos. It's a way of looking at the world.
Yeah, definitely, and I think it's easy to initially think that it comes with a load of ideologies attached because it's got this rich heritage with things like Rock Against Racism and that side of it. But actually, when you think of it as a DIY approach, that I think is the essence of punk. So back then it was, you know, people forming a band, might not be the best bass player in the world, but you're in the band and that's fine. You had something to say and you wanted to get out there and say it, and music was the avenue to do that. Nowadays, you know, you can set up a YouTube channel and put your views out there, and it doesn't have to be well produced. People don't expect slick production values, and there's a whole kind of language that's and production language that's evolved thanks to things like social media, where you know it's not Hollywood production values, but that doesn't impact your enjoyment of it. And I think that comes from that sort of punk ethic, basically.
And do you think there are it's interesting because I don't think it's an accident that this is happening now, in that you've got a system of government which is very much based around slogan, dividing people, attributing blame, othering people. And at the same time, you've got movements arising that are saying exactly the opposite, which is, you know, that they insist upon their right to be heard, their right to solidarity, you know, their right to the ordinary entitlements of citizenship. And it does remind me of the late 70s. The differences are huge, of course, but I just wonder whether you see some of those parallels.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if the differences are that huge, really. You know, there is a disenfranchised younger generation of people who feel like they've got no recourse to get themselves heard. There is widespread kind of, well, depending where you are on the spectrum, discomfort to severe dislike of what's going on politically. There is a whole kind of stuff happening with, you know, increased prevalence or at least visibility of far-right groups or far-right thinking. There's issues with like what Britain's relationship with the rest of the world and Europe. So I'm not actually sure the differences are quite so significant. I think they're a lot more similar maybe than we realise.
Thanks, Mark. Can I turn to Liz, my fellow Liz Mosley, my fellow editor and partner at Tortoise, because just popped up with what I thought was a really a bullseye question, which is about the joy. You know,
Yeah.
Is there a lacking of the ebullience and kind of sheer enjoyment that was part of punk 1.0, as it were?
Well, I just don't know if I agree with Mark in that. And by the way, I was too young for punk the first time around and too uptight anyway. So even if I had been old enough, I wouldn't have been a proper punk at all. And now I'm too old to be part of the sort of equivalent movement. So notwithstanding, I don't have the right to comment. I just feel that if you can lift and shift the equivalent sort of desire to, you know, change the status quo and fight the establishment and to come together, coalesce, you know, the things that Stephanie was saying about coalesce around, you know, causes and stuff, and be really sort of motivated about that. I don't sense any of the same. I think the anxiety and the sense of sort of righteousness inside the modern movement equivalents squishes any of the sort of rah that you got with punk, which was what made it feel joyful. You know, you talk about that moment when Styrene walked on stage and people's just minds were blown. I just don't get the sense that anybody's mind is being blown by anything in that same way inside those equivalent movements at the moment. I don't I might be wrong because I'm not there, but I think that there's an anxiousness at the heart of them now that perhaps I don't read that when I engage with the sort of relics of punk, because like I say, I wasn't there. That would be my thought.
And where do we seek this joy, or is it just gone?
Well, you can come on a thinking. I mean,
exactly.
Raging against the machine in our own little way, Matt. You know,
no, precisely. No, well, there you go. Thinking's a pumpkin.
I don't know. I think people. I don't know that the. I don't know if I would call it joy or rah. I don't know what the word is, but I you know, when you see people having those really amazing collective experiences, it happens in environments that are and will increasingly be now post-COVID. My God, controlled. I don't get the sense of sort of an uncontrolled uprising for the purposes of joy and change. I don't think it happens anymore.
We must continue. We will continue the quest. Thank you, Liz. Daniel, I think you're there. Are you? Hi, Daniel. How are you?
Hang on, let me just get my microphone on. Yeah, I'm all right. You?
Good. Can you? You said something very interesting about the in the chat about the individual. Can you expand on that?
So, I mean, what I was kind of referring to, and is our good old friend neoliberalism, is this idea that kind of the individual has almost become like utmost now. I mean, I should say that I've recently been doing a lot of reading actually on like party systems and things, and my head's partly in political academia land. But it's kind of this idea that kind of in the 20th century, kind of looking in Western Europe, that almost people were like, for example, with the trade unions, they were kind of socializing in sort of circles, and it was creating this idea of like a collective consciousness, a shared experience. And then with kind of the impact of deindustrialization and neoliberalism and this idea about the individual and kind of doing what's right for you, that all of these different things have kind of eroded that collective consciousness. And it's kind of more about, yeah, what's right for you and individual causes. So maybe there's possibly less of that, I don't know, like collaborative approach almost.
It's very interesting. On which subject I'd like to come, time is marching on, but I'd love to come to Celeste again, which is, you know, to the point Daniel raises, how do we, you know, there's a theme that's run through this discussion, which is that of fragmentation, which is that I think we all agree that one of the consequences of social media and the times in which we live has been that we exist in silos and it's there's a constant search for solidarity. And I just, you know, you mentioned you're working on a new film, and as an artist, you know, how are you looking to try and increase that sense of empathy and solidarity and reaching out? That, you know, that aspect of punk that is not just about the individual as a selfish individual, but actually as an autonomous agent who is part of a broader community.
I mean, it's a really good question. I just wanted to, before I answer, I would like to just make a point about individualism and punk, because I think it was there at the start. Actually, a lot of punk was extremely individualistic. You know, I would say it was the hippie movement of the 60s that had a far more collectivist kind of nature in many ways, you know. So even the concept of the commune was born out of that 60s movement, I would think. And the punk kind of squat scene wasn't as, you know, for people like my mum, it wasn't actually as welcoming in many ways as those more hippie kind of collectives that she got involved with when she was a young teenager. So my mum actually made the transition. She was one of the few, you know, hippies that became punks, and she kind of kept that hippie flower power. Someone put in the comments I saw previously that flower power ethos was very much a part of what my mum was doing. And I think flower power was in itself quite punk as well. But yeah, that was a little kind of digress from your question, Matt. But I think in terms of today, one of the, you know, in terms of our filmmaking process, and also in terms of how I would continue to make films, the whole concept of crowdfunding, I think is really interesting in terms of building communities, and also making, you know, it allows artists to fund, you know, art, and fund their work without having, you know, necessarily needing to go to the traditional sources of funding, which are often establishments that have gatekeepers that are not actually easy to access, you know, that are often about who you know and connections and things like that. And it can be really, really difficult for someone to access these kinds of sources, traditional sources of funding, to fund either an album or a film or any kind of artwork. And I think that's always been a big problem, big issue. And crowdfunding actually does offer a really important alternative to that. And in the process of crowdfunding something like a film, a filmmaker or any kind of artist is able to have a direct contact communication channel with the very people who want to see the work, and it creates a community in that sense. So I think that is actually very interesting, and it's very punk because it is ultimately DIY. And for me, I think DIY is the most important, let's say, legacy or positive legacy of punk that does then touch on political activism as well. So yeah, I would say in terms of like any projects that I undertake, you know, going forward, I think the crowdfunding platforms will always be an important part of that process for me, and the most positive.
That's such an interesting way of looking at it. Steph, can I come to you in closing? You have so many avenues of creativity. Tell us, do you think we should be optimistic or pessimistic? Is this a moment, or in fact, is that the wrong way to look at it? Is this a moment where we have to, in the spirit of punk, reclaim our own agency and do something about it?
I think that's exactly it. I think, you know, I was kind of looking through the comments and seeing people saying that, you know, today's generation asking for too much. And I can't stress how wrong that is. You always have to ask for too much. We don't have, not everyone in this country has human rights. We have to be asking for more and more and more. You can never ask for too much from your government. So there does have to be that kind of demanding element and kind of that recognition. I think we've been downtrodden for far too long in this country, and I think there is an English mentality to just accept the worst of the worst, but we kind of have to really fight back against that feeling and just reclaim those punk ethoses, reclaim that DIY understanding of things, that I have agency, and I have agency because of my community. I think that's the way punk has changed over the years, you know. Like Celeste was saying, kind of there was the individualist aspect of punk in the early days, and that wasn't just like individuality in the sense of like I am an individual. It was like individualism in the sense of I'm the only thing that matters sometimes, which is kind of very negative and is basically a capitalist instinct. But I think today that's moved on to be far more community-centered, far more anti-capitalist. I mean, you wouldn't get a punk scene that's capitalist now, that isn't kind of looking at those things, and far more self-reflective. I think people are really kind of putting the time in and doing the work and trying to come to some sort of conclusion. I mean, there are a lot of fights that could be had, but to be honest, we could solve racism tomorrow if people just stopped being racist. Do you know what I mean? Like if white people just thought for once, you could end everything. You could end the worst things that are happening.
Just by stopping
but
doing
we don't. But yeah, exactly. Just by stopping and asking.
Yeah.
By like stopping and thinking, well, why is it that, you know, the estate down the road doesn't have anything, but my road has everything? Why, you know, like there are very simple things that we could be doing tomorrow. if you want to end something, you can end it. And that is the punk ethos. I think people need to remember. We have that agency. There's more of us than there are of them. And we need to take that wherever we're going. When you're in the street, when you're at work, when you're kind of down the local council office, remember that you are acting as, you know, you have that agency as an individual, as kind of a rebellious person, but also as a member of your community to do the right thing.
Thank you, Steph.
So yeah, absolutely.
Such a good note to end on. We've run over, which is my fault, but just in closing, just a there's so much I could say about the last hour. It's been so inspiring and interesting. But you know, clearly Celeste's point about DIY is absolutely the heart of this. The prospects of crowdfunding, the liberating power of technology, the spirit of inclusion, but also aligned with urgency, I think is so much a part of this. And you know, Steph's words at the end about the importance of agency and simply not accepting things that don't have to be the way that they are. And you know, her words, if you want to end something, just end it, will ring in my ears for a long time to come. Thank you so much to Celeste and Steph for coming along. It's been a fantastic hour. Thank you all for joining us. Do come along to Future Thinkings. Sadly, that's the end of this one, but there are plenty more. Check out what we've got coming up in April. There are plenty of wonderful things in the works. It's been a terrific hour. Have a lovely weekend. See you all soon.